Hi, everyone. So, I'm going to talk today about migration and movement, and particularly people moving into Britain, into the British Isles in the past. And if we think about past migrations into Britain, you probably first off might have some ideas about the 20th century, so people coming from the Caribbean, from East Africa, or from India or Pakistan, or places like that. And if we have to go back a bit further in time, and of course, we've got people like the Normans, the Romans, or the Vikings. But despite the fact that we know there's quite a lot of people who have moved into Britain at different times, I don't think we really think of ourselves as a migrant nation. We think of ourselves more, I'd say, as an island nation. But what about if we go back really a long way? We really go back far in time. So beyond the time when there's any notion of a Britain or an England, beyond any kind of English language, in fact, beyond written history at all. In fact, we can go so far back in time that Britain's actually not even an island at all. It's still joined to the continent. It's still part of the Eurasian landmass. So that's what I want to talk to you about today, about Britain in prehistory and the prehistory of migration here. So we're going to take a big jump back in time, but I can't do that with you all in one go. Okay, so we're going to take a little jump back first. We're going to jump back to the late Victorian period, and we're going to start off here. In Somerset, at Cheddar Gorge. And it's here, during the last decades of the 19th century, that this guy, Richard Cox Goff, discovered and excavated and blasted out a series of caves that he made into a major tourist attraction. They were show caves. But it's actually a year after Richard died that the really big discovery was made, the one that we're actually here for, that we're interested in. So that discovery was made in December of 1903, and it was made by Richard's son, Arthur, who was digging a drainage ditch to try and combat the seasonal flooding that they had in the caves. They tended to make all the big discoveries in the winter, because that's when there weren't any tourists around. So the workmen who were working on the cave actually blasted out and uncovered the skeleton of an adult male. And rather quickly, this skeleton made big news. Experts of the day said that perhaps he was the body of the first Englishman, and that he was of extreme importance, that he was at least 40,000 years old, and perhaps as much as 80,000 years old. Well, that's not entirely true. What we actually know today is that Cheddar Man, as he became known, is actually about 10,000 years old. But he is still certainly very important. It's extremely important for a number of reasons. Firstly, because he's the only near-complete skeleton that we have from that kind of time period. And he's also important because he's the only one where we have a complete skull, or near-complete skull. And here is the skull in this rather posed setting with the two brothers, William and Arthur, staring at it. But they seem to be enjoying themselves, which is what I really like about this picture. Okay, so what else do we know about Cheddar Man? Well, he's definitely a man, and that has been a subject of a little bit of debate over the years because he has a rather gracile, slender skeleton. He was probably in his early 20s when he died, and he was buried deliberately, it seems, and he was buried on his own. And today, it looks something like this. The skeleton's been better assembled, and you can see it at the Natural History Museum. It's on display a couple of galleries away from where my office is. So, we've worked on Cheddar Man and a number of other individuals over the years and built together quite a large, complex project exploring the history of the British Isles. And one of the things that came up as a result of that project was the opportunity to take part in a Channel 4 documentary where we were going to explore Cheddar Man and his history, to build up more of a story about him. So that was good because we'd already had quite a lengthy project working on the history of the British Isles. But what the people who put the documentary together wanted to know about was something a little bit more complicated, a little bit more detail, and that was about his appearance, about his skin colour, hair colour, and eye colour. And what we were able to do for them was to supply that information. We passed it on to the people who made the reconstruction. What they came back with was this: an individual with a rather small face compared to the overall size of his head, with blue eyes, and with dark curly hair, and obviously with dark skin. And that was a surprise for some people, for most of the people I talked to, actually. And most of the people I talked to actually seemed to think this was rather cool. People who saw the show were generally quite enjoyed it. We weren't particularly surprised by this because similar information had already been generated by a group a couple of years previously looking at different skeletons around Europe of a similar kind of age. They'd already identified that dark skin was perhaps normal for people about 10,000 years ago. But what we'd been able to do was better quantify exactly how dark that was. And we'd done that using a tool borrowed from forensic sciences. But some people didn't think that this was very cool. Some people, I think, were expecting to see something a bit more like this, which was the results of the previous reconstruction. Both reconstructions are obviously quite different, but they do share one feature at least, which is this rather wispy facial hair. And I'm surprised about that because there's really no evidence either way from the archaeological or genetic data that would tend to actually suggest that. But that is perhaps their only shared feature, actually. So those people who didn't think it was very cool were a bit surprised, and they made their surprise known on social media, as you might expect. And actually, things got rather heated there. And you can look that up, and I don't really want to go into too much detail about it. But here's one of the sort of slightly odd events that happened there. One of my childhood heroes indirectly congratulating me on having upset some people. So that was a bit weird, actually. And that went on for a while. So what became clear to us was something rather disappointing. As I already said to you, we'd spent quite a bit of time getting a pretty good understanding of what the population history of the British Isles actually looks like. So how do you get from someone like this to people in the audience today? I meant Cheddar Man, obviously not Billy Bragg. So that's what I'm going to go through now. That's what we're going to have a look at now. Okay, but before we can do that, we have to work out how exactly we're going to look at that information. We really have a lot of data here. The human genome has 3.2 billion base pairs, and I can't just keep flashing that up because we'd run out of time quite quickly. So what we need to do is find a way of crunching those data down and just pulling out the most important and interesting parts of it. And the method that we often use just to get a handle on the data initially is called a principal components analysis, and that's what I'm going to show you here. So these are genome data that have been squashed down onto something that looks a bit like a graph or a plot, and so individuals who are close together are genetically similar to each other, regardless of where they might happen to come from. Okay. So let's start here with Cheddar Man, but all alone, like he was in Goth's Cave, he's not actually doing much for us. He's not telling us very much. So let's put on the other 5 individuals from Britain, from which we have very small amounts of genome sequence data, and see what happens. What happens is then that they all plot together quite neatly, despite the fact that we have individuals here from Scotland, Wales, and southwest England. They actually all look quite similar to each other. Let's expand the search a bit more across the rest of Europe. And what we have here are some more individuals. The ones in blue are older individuals, slightly older ones from slightly earlier time periods. The ones in that kind of dark red color are of a similar age. And these are samples that have been taken from Spain, Hungary, Germany, Sweden, Luxembourg, all sorts of places, including Britain. What you see is that the British ones kind of bridge the gap between the earlier and the later ones. But there's still not much of a picture here. Where we do get a bit of a surprise is if we jump forward in time a bit more. Okay, so what we have here, about 4,000 years after Cheddar Man died, is that something quite surprising happened in Britain, and that's the origins of farming. So the first farmers that arrived in Europe several thousand years earlier, they arrived in Greece. They're the red folks on that plot. They've made their way across Europe over several millennia and eventually arrive in Britain, where we have the grey individuals on the plot. And what you can see there about those grey people is, well, there are two important things to get out of this. They are genetically extremely different to the hunter-gatherers that were in Britain at that time, and they entirely replaced them, complete replacement of the population. Now, it's always tempting at these points to think of some kind of vast horde arriving and committing some kind of genocidal act on the people, on the peaceful hunter-gatherer people. We don't have any evidence for that at all. So what we think, in fact, is quite plausible is that there are actually remarkably few people in the British Isles at this time. Hunter-gatherers arrive and just take over can easily take over the country. What's even more surprising is that a very similar thing happens about 1,300 years later. A second, genetically very distinct group arrives in the British Isles. These are the so-called beaker people, who are called that because of the distinctive ceramic vessels that they're often buried with. And these beaker people are also genetically very different and seem to completely replace the Neolithic peoples that were there before, the farmers that were there before. And this, it seems, is the last major population replacement that we can detect at the resolution that we can work with at the moment with ancient DNA data. Because if we bring up now the population, modern population across Europe, you can see that those beaker people sit pretty much on top of current British Isles populations. And in fact, the populations of northwestern Europe are kind of in a bit of a smear across there as well. Okay, so what can we draw from this? What do we really have to conclude here? So one of the things that I realized sometime after we'd done this work and the documentary was shown was that for some people who were upset by the way that we had reconstructed Cheddar Man, the issue was one of continuity, population continuity. We had challenged that notion that they had, that there was long-term population continuity in Britain. And that's very much not what the data seem to be saying. The prehistory of Britain is one where populations are under a series of replacements. The other thing that you can also draw from these data is about migration and our modern-day concerns about mass migration and how it affects society. So what you can see here is that the scale of migration today, despite the advent of globalization and mass transportation, is nothing like the kind of migrations that we must have had in the past that have led to these very large-scale replacements. Thanks very much.